I just sat down with the man who built the most controversial contract in healthcare. And as the NHS is weighing up whether to tear up its £330 million deal with Palantir, almost every conversation is about the politics. And why wouldn't it be? Their founder, Peter Thiel, said this about the NHS.
You just rip the whole thing from the ground out, start over.
And here's their CEO, Alex Karp, on what Palantir is here to do.
Palantir is here to disrupt and make the institutions we partner with the very best in the world, and when it's necessary, to scare enemies and on occasion kill them.
And yet, they're cult-loved. Fans call him Daddy Karp, and the organizations that work with them say they're light years ahead of everyone else. But I'm not here to tell you your politics. I'm here to figure out what this contract really is, and if the NHS has any credible alternatives. Tom Bartlett led the engineering teams inside NHS England that built the platform, and as we get closer to a decision on the break clause, this is his first podcast where he reveals what's really going on between Palantir and the NHS.
So the strongest case for triggering the break clause is about, the NHS has got concentrated critical national data infrastructure in a single supplier with significant geopolitical, reputational and political risk. The longer the contract runs, the deeper the dependency becomes. If you're going to make a change, the break clause is the least disruptive moment to do it, because waiting longer just increases that switching cost. And if you think that UK sovereignty over health data infrastructure is a strategic priority, then the short-term pain is worth the long-term gain of independence. Where have we heard that before? And but that's a coherent argument. I don't agree with that though, because there's nothing to switch to. But I understand why people hold that view.
And then Tom, what's the you've kind of hinted at it, but I mean, what's the biggest argument for keeping with Palantir and not triggering it? Like, if you're really trying to convince someone, how would you convince them?
Yeah, I think it's important to look back over the last 2 decades and the fact that there's been 8 national strategies and we're still in a terrible mess with data. We've finally got something that works after all these years. We've finally got it. We've got 137 trusts live on it. The platform program is rated green, and these first 6 products are just the very beginning of this. You're going to have so many products there that clinicians are going to innovate and produce. So this is just the beginning. If you trigger this break clause, you're going straight back to square one with no place to go, with hundreds of millions already spent, and you've got 137 trusts reverting back to spreadsheets, whiteboards, WhatsApp. Show me an MP who wants to go and explain that to their constituents.
As Deputy Director of Data Engineering at NHS England, you led, the build of the Federated Data Platform, FDP, with Palantir. And I'm just really curious, what kinds of problems can it solve? I think a lot of people don't actually understand what it is, or what are the problems to be solved by it? Can you explain in a very easy way, what does it do?
My team was involved in building out the national part of the Federated Data Platform. So the Federated Data Platform consists of various different components, one of which is Palantir's Foundry. And Palantir's Foundry is installed in every organisation. There was an install for NHS England. There was one for each trust. There's one for each ICB. So each area's got their own they call it a tenant. And within that, each organisation is the data controller. So they've kind of got control over who can access it and what it's there to do. And when I was talking to my engineers about it, a lot of them said to me, "Why are we using Foundry? We've already got Databricks. We've already got Azure. We've got all these systems that are best in class. Why are we moving to this?" And when you look at it just as a system on its own, that's a natural question. Why do we use that for data warehousing? If you're just sticking in that analytical space, it doesn't offer that much more. But it's when you start looking at what it can do in terms of the front line. I like to think of it like an operating system. I think someone's called it before. If you compare it to the iPhones, you've got your iOS, which is your operating system, and then people build apps, and anyone can build those apps. Third parties. You haven't got Apple just building all the apps. Anyone can build apps and sell them on the operating system through the App Store, and it's a very similar model to that. The fact that you're on Foundry gives you that standard platform across the whole of the NHS, across 220 organisations. That's just the trusts. Then there's the 25 odd ICBs and NHS England. So there's the standardisation across all of those different organisations provides that foundation to build on. And then you're asking what can it do? Well, if you're building apps for the NHS, what do you want it to do? Your imagination is the limit, really. You've got all these different clinical processes that some of them are very self-contained. And so maybe, if it was a type of operation, maybe because it's on that standard platform, it could pull outcome measures from all the other areas that are doing that same operation and show you what your outcomes are compared to everybody else's. So it'd be giving something back to the clinician, not just a place for them to record their information. But if it's something that spans different areas, so for example, an ambulance trust versus a mental health trust and a hospitals trust that's running an A&E, there's a convergence point for those services. In the ambulance is handing off to A&E, mental health patients are in A&E. The A&E can't see who's coming through the ambulance because they haven't got access to the ambulance systems. They can't see that patients coming in are also being seen by mental health services, and they've got a whole mental health history to consider. If all of those systems are on the same platform, you could imagine building applications that straddle those organisations and help A&E teams see what the mental health history of the patient is, alerting the care team in the mental health team that their patient's just been to A&E or is on their way to A&E in the ambulance. So the ability for them to respond to that information goes up. In that example, it's not about analytics. It does do analytics, and people have raised concerns about how well it does analytics. So if you compare it to Tableau, which looks beautiful, the tools within Foundry aren't as good. Yes, you've got things like R, and you've got some native tools. But you ask any analyst who's just been working on Tableau or similar, they'll kind of say, "Can I just carry on using Tableau, please?"
So, Tom, is it fair for me to think of the Federated Data Platform built with Palantir? Is it fair for me to think of it as a kind of operational operating system almost that allows all the many parts of the NHS to communicate effectively, but also build things that then work across the whole system? And really the sky's the limit in terms of what can be built. It's this kind of like foundational layer. Is that like the right way to think about it?
Yeah, exactly. So the sharing element of it is interesting. So I think the Palantir term for the technology is marketplace, which allows you to kind of bundle up an application that can then be reinstalled in any other Foundry instance. NHS has rebadged that to the Solutions Exchange, and that is not just the marketplace technology, but it's also a kind of commercial framework where people can build things. So that might be a local team, maybe it's some clinicians working with their local data team, or maybe with the AI sort of coding support that's within Foundry, somebody who's quite savvy has built their own technology within their own kind of sandbox in a trust somewhere. But then they realize, maybe they've been to a conference and told everyone about it, and everyone's like, oh, I want to try that. They could in future put that on the Solutions Exchange, and then other trusts could choose to, because they're the data controllers, they could choose to or not to take those products. And I expect, like we see on the smartphones, there will be competitors, so there'll be an incentive and a commercial incentive for different developers to make things better fit for the front line. And thereby they'll get more data used out of it. And one of the kind of components of FDP that really enables this is the canonical data model. So you don't just need a standard platform. You need to have a standard data model that underpins it as well. Otherwise, when you build things in one area, you try and transplant it somewhere else, and the data definitions are different, and you end up having to remap everything. And we already see that kind of cost in lots of places in the NHS. It's a hidden cost, and people don't factor it in and don't really understand it very well. But when you see data projects taking a long time, it's often because people are having to try and figure out what each data item means and then kind of remap that to whatever's being moved.
A lot of the discourse has been quite political on, people's views of Palantir as a company. And, I have my own views and everyone has their own views, but I didn't find it that interesting. I found, or what I wanted to find was just more of a kind of objective take on what it is this partnership unlocks and whether Palantir are the right partner for the NHS. And one thing I just kept thinking about, and I didn't quite get to a satisfying answer, was, is there a good alternative? And I understand that the alternatives to Palantir in this world are generally, big tech players like, Oracle and IBM. Then you've got big consulting houses. And then finally, you've got, I guess, an in-house build by the NHS itself. But like, from your vantage point, is there actually a real alternative to Palantir, or is it like they are very uniquely positioned to do this type of thing?
Yeah, I've said a few times already that they are uniquely placed. And if you work through your list, I think the competitors in the big tech space, where you've seen people apply for the bid that was put out in 23, and then a lot of people say, this company could do it or that company could do it, and I've genuinely looked into those because I would love it if there was another alternative that could put some competition in this space and be a genuine competitor. But whenever I look at these alternatives, they are very much in that analytical space that I described, and they could potentially start moving towards that frontline applications that adds the real value, but they're not really focused on that, and it would be hard for them to do it. Whereas the architecture of Foundry is such that it's absolutely completely enmeshed, that and no one else has got close to that. I think when you talk about the the kind of PricewaterhouseCoopers, no, sorry, PwC, what do they stand for? is that right?
I think that's maybe, right. Yeah, like the Deloitte, Accentures, big consulting houses.
Yeah, the Deloittes and the Accentures of this world, they provide staff and they provide a capability to deploy things. They don't really build software, and so they can help with it, but they wouldn't ever be able to produce a replacement. And then if we come on to the in-house side, I think that's really unrealistic. If you look at what the track record of the NHS trying to do that, the focus of the NHS is not on developing technology. There will always be the next thing that's headline news for the NHS that they need to worry about and work through. If you take what's happened with the NHS Digital, where there was a 30% cut in workforce merging into NHS England, and then NHS England merging now into Department of Health and Social Care, there's a further 50% cut. And this all applies to data roles as well as every other role. And there's you'd have to have a very stable workforce to be able to, over a long period of time, build something that could compete. Palantir have had 20 years in Silicon Valley and billions of pounds invested to get to where they've got to now. And when you look at the NHS, the data people are being paid on a clinician's pay grade, pay scale. Nurses are a fantastic, valuable profession, but nobody goes into nursing for the money. It's very easy for other companies who have got money in the private sector to come and poach people who are doing a great job in the NHS, and I've seen that quite
Tom,
a lot.
Would that be? I mean, is there a talent thing there as well, where if you're able to pay 3 to 5x what the NHS is willing to pay, that you can just get a bunch of really talented folk that would be hard to get in the NHS in the current situation?
So you're asking if the NHS paid more, would they be able to do it?
Is it that somewhere like Palantir just brings really, really good talent that even with the NHS being a little more stable, not having those cuts that you described, it would just be hard to match? Is that an element as well?
Yeah, I think one area that perhaps has got more hope than the NHS building it in-house would be if there was some company that was government sponsored, perhaps somewhere in the public sector, but not within the NHS, that had the freedoms to hire more broadly than the NHS does, that had a bit of backing and focus behind it, that was really focused on maybe around digital sovereignty and homegrown AI capability and a homegrown rival to Palantir. If that route was taken, I think that's probably got a lot more legs than doing it within the NHS. But even that would be, probably a decade-long investment, and we'd have to be prepared to divest from American companies, which we've just made a massive investment in American, or we've allowed them to invest in our capabilities. So yeah, I think there would have to be quite a bit of policy change to get to that.
And Tom, I thought you made a really interesting point on the cost, and I think the figure that's been reported on, I think it's the amount that's been committed or forecasted, which is £330 million to Palantir from the NHS. And it sounds like a big number, but I think you had some interesting thoughts on how it might not actually be a really big number. And I remember, even whilst I was practicing in a pretty large trust, we had a whole migration to Epic. And I forget how long of a period that was, but I remember it being, almost a £200 million deal just to transition to an EHR.
In one locality.
In one locality. So this is a big national project. I mean, is it expensive from what you understand?
Yeah, I mean, is it expensive? It's all relative, isn't it? And you've made the comparison with electronic patient records. I think it's a good deal if you compare it to what's being spent now on data analytics. So if you go to any particular trust, you'll see they've got a data team and a data warehouse, and they'll have either bought Microsoft licenses or maybe they've subscribed to a cloud provider, and they're spending huge amounts of money there. And so FTP can be used as a data warehouse, and that's one of the opportunities for trusts, is to replace their data warehouse with FTP, and that creates not just the benefit of saving the money, because it's centrally the 330 million is centrally funded, whereas each NHS organisation is paying separately for their data warehousing and analytics. So they would be able to make that saving, but then add a lot more value as well. And if you compare that kind of investment case, you'd probably be spending, if you assumed that there was 100k per trust on existing spend, spend an extra 100 to get FTP, even though the trusts don't pay that. But then all the value you would unlock by doing so, because you would then have access in the analytics space to all of your shadow IT. You would have mitigated all of those risks that you've got around, confidentiality and loss of data that trusts are currently running, but perhaps they're even unaware of. And I think the true comparative figure would be, what is the overall total cost of ownership across the NHS of data management right now? And nobody's quantified that. If you did quantify that, it'd be a scary number, I'm sure. But we've spent, I think it's about 2 billion over since 2021, I think, around then, on sort of electronic patient records and improving those, and handing all this money to these big American companies, but for much less of a novel upgrade and much less value. So if you're talking value for money, I think there's a really strong case for looking at all of those things that FTPs can do that I've described.
Could we work through an example of a use case of what FTP enables? And then I was wondering if you could help me understand what are the 2 or 3 unique capabilities Palantir would bring to that. So as an example, from my understanding, FTP would enable something like, if in one trust someone had coded up an AI tool that helps get through waiting lists faster, helps prioritize them and ultimately work through them faster, it would mean now in this FTP world that another trust across the country could also use that tool very, very easily, and they'd have this kind of shared language and kind of interoperability and transferability. Could you just help explain to me, what is it that Palantir are doing with the NHS that enables that to work?
Yeah, I think the most unique feature of Palantir's software is their ontology. So to me, that's really what bridges the gap between frontline applications and the analytics space. And it is quite a hard one to understand this, because when I bet you as soon as I said the word ontology, a whole load of your listeners would have gone, "Oh no, I know exactly what he's talking about." But this is part of the confusion, because the word ontology is quite well established in computer science and data science to mean something very specific about the semantics of a data system. But Palantir have kind of co-opted that word and applied it to some bespoke functionality that only their platform has got, as far as I know. And what the ontology does is it allows the data to be treated as code, and so you package up the data with the semantics and the ability to live link it to other pieces of data and to take actions on that data. So, for example, you'd have a button on a screen that says remove patient from waiting list, and then within that ontology, there would be an edit to that line, and that patient status would be moved from waiting to no longer waiting. So that doesn't happen in that analytics workspace. The orthodoxy of it is that you pass data between those two. You pass data between analytics and frontline applications. You don't bring them both together. And just to get a bit technical for a minute, people have the orthodoxy is that for a frontline system that needs to do surgical edits, like a banking system where you need to make a payment, you put in how much you want to pay, you press the button, that record in the bank's database gets updated with that one person's one payment. That's a very surgical edit to that data. And the systems that support that are very much geared towards, they're optimized for that. So they're very highly normalized. The way the data structures it made so efficient so that it can handle millions of such surgical edits at any one time. And that's how the banks can have so many customers using their apps at any one time. But then if you move across to at the analytics space, they're not trying to do surgical stuff. They're trying to look across all the bank accounts for a bank, across all those billions of records, trillions of records, and find trends amongst them. So you've got this optimization towards big data. And there's all these concepts like pre-aggregation of aggregate figures and things like that, and cubes and all of that kind of snowflake approach to sort of the way the data models are set out. And that's all taken its evolution, and it's gone through huge amounts of progress, but they've never come together. And what the ontology does is it kind of inverts the index, and it sort of uses what's known as an Elasticsearch to kind of be able to do both at the same time. I won't go too much into the detail of how the tech works, but suffice to say that you can, within the same ontology object, you can use it for analytics and to make those surgical edits, and that's what allows you to build an app on top of that ontology. The ontology acts as the back end for the apps. You build the front end app. You can build that in the native technologies like Workshop, or you can build it in open source front end web development technologies like React. And then it's the back end for that, but it also serves as an analytical back end, and people can query. If you had a waiting list product, you'd be able to query across that waiting list product across the whole country potentially, and it would perform in each of those two use cases. And that's really the secret sauce of what makes Palantir unique, Foundry unique to this problem.
God, it makes sense. And is there anything else from Palantir? I mean, I hear that they have these forward deployed engineers. They have a bunch of other things that I hear about. I don't quite know what they are, like Gotham, Foundry, etc., etc. Is there anything else outside of the ontology that makes Palantir very uniquely suited to doing this kind of work?
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure they would give a much better answer than I will, but some of the things that stand out on that, I think in terms of the forward deployed engineers, I think that's quite a good system they've got there, where they kind of rotate their engineers into organisations like the NHS to go and work with people like the engineers I used to work with, but then they rotate them back to go and work on developing the platform itself. So they kind of bring that frontline knowledge back to the development. And I saw that they were making requested changes quite quickly, much more quickly than the EPR vendors that I'd worked with in the past. So I think that's a good working style. And I was sort of made aware of the kind of culture, I suppose, there is around, if you see a problem, it's yours, you own it, you fix it. If you see an opportunity, it's yours, you own it, you fix it. And there's a lot of empowerment. I went to an event once. I was working with somebody who'd only just joined the company, and I was asking him what's it like working there, and he was just describing a really high level of autonomy that he'd been given. And unfortunately, that doesn't really translate to the NHS. That's not something I've seen a lot of in the NHS, where people are kind of given the ownership and the authority to just go and do something. There's a lot of kind of approvals that are needed, lots of disagreement that stops things from happening and slows things down. So I think there's probably a bit of a tension there between how the NHS works and how Palantir works, and it doesn't always. It sometimes creates friction. But then the other thing to mention is around AI, because I think that's one area that it's probably not a unique thing to Palantir, but it definitely helps, which is they've got the AI powered forward deployed engineer, or AI FDE. And that's what allows clinicians to kind of just prompt into the system, please build me an app that does whatever it is they want to do. And it will use Claude or one of the other large language kind of models to build and code up and link up and deploy a solution. And I saw that working really well. Palantir came to me and said, Tom, we've built this thing. Can we try it out? And what it was is it was looking at all the pipelines that we were running. So we were pumping huge amounts of data through this system, and it was consuming compute, and it was consuming storage, and it was generating cost. And they had built an AI that would scan the logs, find what had used up a certain level of compute or storage, assess where the efficiency is, write the code to make the improvement and the optimization, and then present it as a pull request to the engineer, who could then review it and sign it off. And the first time we did that, I asked one of my engineers to go and have a look at that and make use of that. And he looked at it, he reviewed it, it was good, he approved it, and it saved like tens of thousands. It was straight away, and that was just the first one. And so there's so much opportunity here, not just for supporting the front line, but also for supporting the data processing and the analytics side as well with the AI tools.
So Tom, Palantir have this, pretty unique capability. It, falls, based on their ontology. They've got great teams that they forward deploy, and actually it doesn't cost a lot of money either. It's pretty decent value for money, although that's depends on your take. Are there any things where Palantir falls short against similar comparable companies? I'm just looking at other companies that had bid for the FTP project. Like I think Oracle had, IBM had. I know there are other companies also just involved and collaborating, like I think IQVIA, some of the consulting houses, etc. It's a bit of a broad question, but like, are there areas where they sort of fall short a little bit, or like there are comparable companies that are better performance than them?
Yeah, I think the big one is around the analytics, and so I think there's a lot of very specialist companies who've done amazing things in that space, and whether that's even just basic kind of sorts of things someone would do quickly in Excel, or those beautiful visualizations that you see in Tableau, those kinds of things, they're they're out of the box in the way that other companies can do them. So I would say that's one area. When NHS England was moving its analyst groups onto FTP, that was a common complaint, was it doesn't do what my other tool does. And also, I'm not sure if this was I don't think it was necessarily a platform issue. It was probably more the way it was implemented, but the information governance around getting data in and getting data back out again created friction. So there were areas like that weren't as good as some of the other technologies that were in play at NHS England. So I'd say that's probably the main area that I spotted where there was a bit of an issue.
I've heard one complaint in partnering with Palantir is that we're selling Palantir NHS data, or we're giving Palantir NHS data. That's like a common thing that I see in the press as well. And I think the answer is a little bit more nuanced, but I'm curious on your take. I know we can get into the throes of kind of GDPR, and perhaps it is useful to talk about what the differences are between a processor and a controller a little bit. But I'm just curious, like, is that a valid concern to have, that in partnering with Palantir on such a big project, you're basically handing over NHS data to them?
Yeah, I think it's quite a serious sort of point, really, because it's not just campaigners saying that, it's the MPs have said that in the House of Commons. So I think the quotes were, I'm just looking up here, Polanski and Corbyn both said it. So Polanski said it gives them access to analyse our medical health records, and Corbyn said that they're going to get Palantir getting their hands on personal health records and everything else for research purposes. And that's such a egregious kind of misstatement of what is actually happening. It doesn't give Palantir access to analyse medical health records. It doesn't allow Palantir to get their hands on personal health records and everything else and use for research purposes. That's a really specific claim, and it's totally wrong. And it's a shame that people are talking about this, because it's baseless. The way that the data is governed, the controllership, the legal framework is GDPR. Controllership sits with the NHS. If Palantir was to do anything like that, it would be illegal, and it would completely destroy their reputation as somebody anyone could work with, if they're lawbreakers. So it's just factually incorrect and creates fear that need not be there. It depresses and frustrates anybody who's actually trying to work on FTP. It distracts from the true debates about how do we set up that data sovereignty. They should really be talking about that. What's their vision for the UK version of Silicon Valley, if that's the direction we've got to go in? That's what the Westminster Hall debate should be talking about, not trying to tear down things that are actually working and have been rated as green by the government's sort of watchdog on projects, which I think only about 15% of programs get rated green. And it's also had a bit of a impact on things like the patient opt-out, these kind of stories, where you've got campaigners like the Good Law talking about the opt-out in context of Palantir. And we've seen, if you look at the online figures for the national data opt-out, since January, those figures have gone up. They've gone up probably between 5 and 10 times what they were in previous periods. So it's really, and that's an issue, because that data, it doesn't opt you out of Palantir. You can't opt out of FTP. That's there for direct care purposes. You can't opt out of that. You can only opt out of things for research and planning, and so it's ineffective to do it. But people are doing it because the campaigners are pointing them to do it, and that then means future research projects are going to have biases and inaccuracies because that data is not there. Because people don't opt out uniformly across the population. There's certain demographics who are more likely to opt out, and that then creates bias within research. So, it's quite harmful what these campaigners and politicians are doing. It's not just depressing for the people working on it, it's actually got harms involved as well.
And Tom, I understand sort of contractually and through IG that, Palantir are not able to sort of sell and experiment on your data in the way that's been described. But I'm curious, structurally, is there anything stopping them? As an example, I hear that there's this Cloud Act where, the US is able to compel, US companies, even those operating in the UK, to hand over data essentially. And I'm just curious, if Palantir was compelled at any point to hand over NHS data, is there anything structurally like, encryption or any other smart things that you guys would have worked on that would stop them from even being able to do that?
To me, that's a bit of a rabbit hole to go down, really. There are reasonable precautions in place against that, but with any software that's been provided by another provider, you're never 100% able to say it's completely fail safe. But that applies to all other American companies. We've got Epic in place across the country. We've got Microsoft running all of those SQL Server data warehouses. All of those are subject to the Cloud Act. So I think anytime I've looked at what's the structural, you end up in this endless circular debates about it, and it at the end of the day, it's about trust and whether you think that American companies generally should be able to take that data, given that the American government could compel them to give up a record or two under the Cloud Act.
I think it's a good point you raised, because there are a bunch of other American companies like, you've mentioned Epic, Microsoft, etc., Salesforce, who do work with NHS data. And I guess the problem or the criticism doesn't really come up in that context, although I'm sure it does, in your circles, which are, much more astute in this world. But it hasn't. Okay, that's fine. No. Maybe so. It doesn't come up. Then I guess my question, and I said, it's not worth really getting into the politics here, but I think perhaps there is a question: is Palantir uniquely problematic out of all of these big tech companies? I mean, you see, Peter Thiel come to the Oxford Union and say, the NHS needs to be, ripped up from the ground. You see Alex Karp publish this like really controversial manifesto, making, a bunch of controversial statements. I mean, I guess I don't ask you a political question because it's a little bit unfair. That's not why I asked you to come on here. But do you think there's a fair argument to say, Palantir, like, they're uniquely different, they're like uniquely problematic as compared to all of these other companies like Microsoft and others?
Yeah, I think where people say that, I understand their point. They're talking about the origins of the company and that they were invested in specifically to build software for military and kind of CIA and things like that. And so it's different to companies that have come from other origins, but you could also criticize the origins of some of those other companies. I think one of the ones that was particularly in mind was around some of these EPRs where they'd been developed in America, and it was all around billing, and that was the main focus, and not really that applicable to NHS. It's a different criticism, but if you look at the origins of some of these companies, and also some of the things that some of the people say, Frank Hester made those comments about Diane Abbott, and that wasn't really an issue as per the contracts that organisation had, and so I do take seriously the points that people make about that, because the NHS has got very strong values around kindness, care, compassion, and it's seen as something that is a very, it's a force for good, the NHS, and everybody recognises that, and the values that it represents and that it holds are completely different to a military organisation, almost the opposite. And so I do understand why that is. But if you were to look practically, what could you do about that? And this is something that I think the debate gets wrong, is the mechanism through which we have ended up with companies like this allowed that. So the lawmakers, these MPs, have created a legal framework that the NHS has to follow, and in any procurement they do that very seriously and professionally, and they're following the law, and the law does not say anywhere that the politics of the organisation that you're buying from have to meet X criteria. And if you think about what it would mean if they did do that, you could imagine the next kind of life-saving drug that cures cancer or whatever can't be used by the NHS because so-and-so said X, Y, Z. Is it really wise to pursue that? But if it is wise to pursue that, why aren't we pursuing that? Because surely that's the answer. We don't pick on results that have gone through a process when it's a natural result of that process. We should pick on the process and get the process right. So that's where I'd prefer to see the attention on the procurement process rather than the results of it, even though I'm not sure you'd ever get there. I'm sure this has been debated in the lawmaking already.
Yeah, it's a really tough problem. Whatever your value system is, you wanting the kind of conflict between wanting to kind of uphold that, but then also wanting to have access to best in class technology and have a kind of objective, fair process in procuring that. I think I don't have a good answer there, and I think it's kind of up to people, right, to make their mind on that. I thought the last thing I wanted to talk about in terms of a sort of Palantir critique was this BMJ exposé that came out, talking specifically about their work with Chelsea and Westminster. There were two criticisms there. Number one was that the way the data was reported on and the improvement that was shown in, they made a bunch of claims around like waiting list times, improving using FTP. That was sort of, the numbers were a bit cooked. They'd used a baseline when things were really bad because of COVID, and then things started improving because COVID was, veering off. And so they were like, look how great a job we're doing, when really it was because things were everywhere were improving. That was number one. And then number two was just around just conflict of interest, whether there were a bunch of people who happened to have pretty strong links to Palantir who were also involved in leadership in Chelsea and Westminster. So I just wondered, like, what did you make of that criticism that the BMJ posted?
Yeah. I thought it was quite specific criticism. I wouldn't judge the iPhone based on a faulty calculator app. That to me, that's very, very specific, and I don't defend the benefit figures. Maybe they're right, maybe they're wrong. I'm not defending them, but are we really saying that the NHS can't be improved through the use of data? Is the premise wrong? So that would be my comment on that, really. In terms of the conflict of interest, I've never worked with Chelsea and Westminster. I've not really spoken about that publicly or even really formulated that many thoughts about that. But the trust's responsible for their governance arrangements, and what I can speak to really is whether 137 other trusts have deployed it and got benefit, got use out of it. So I think it's the bigger picture is important there. I think it would be inflating it to say that one trust has somehow influenced the whole of the country, when it's based in one small trust.
Was the general opinion within your circles in the NHS, was it that FTP was like a great program that was having a lot of success across, and this one case might be a bit of an outlier? Like, was that the general consensus? I'm just curious, like, how people saw it from the inside.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, it's never really come up to me that particular example about Chelsea and Westminster. If you're interested in what the engineers thought of Foundry, and I think there's a lot of mystery around it for the engineers that came with me through NHS Digital, and they weren't really sure what it was or what it did. when I met some of the people who'd been implementing it and picked up the line management of that team, there was a lot of enthusiasm. I remember one guy telling me, this is what he said verbatim. He said, "I'm an unapologetic fanboy." So I thought, wow, that's pretty strong. It must be something to it. And then when I worked with that team, the energy there was really, it was a good energy. People felt like they were doing something worthwhile. They felt like they were in the spotlight and working with the best technology. And there was a real buzz in that team. And people really cared, really cared about getting it right. And then, as others kind of came on board and were being asked to use it who hadn't been part of that, I think there was a healthy dose of skepticism, and there were quite a few sort of established ways of working that were being challenged by the way that Palantir encouraged the organisation to use Foundry, and so that did create a bit of friction, and there were some tensions there, I guess. But yeah, I think overall,
Tom, what kind of ways, like ways of working?
So just to give a specific example, the way that the development of code on the platform is done via branching. So you've got your master branch, and you take a branch offline that takes the data, it branches the data and the code, and you can kind of work on that in a sandbox, get it right, and then you deploy it back to the master branch. And that was really different to how the the data engineers worked. They were more used to having a specific environment for development and a specific environment for test, and then you deploy it to production, and nobody's got access to production. It's kind of, so it was just like a different architecture really for how people developed, and how they were working through what the merits of one are versus the other, and perhaps a bit of a culture clash.
Do you have 5 minutes for like a rapid fire?
Yeah, let's do it.
Okay. So I've got 4 questions for you. So what's one thing about the FDP that most NHS England staff don't know?
I think probably the thing that was hardest to gain consensus on in NHS England was what the ontology is. I think a lot of people just dismissed it as irrelevant and treated FDP as another data warehouse tool. But the potential I spoke about to condense the data models and enhance the analytics hasn't really been scratched at that national level. They use a lot of different data models to standardize data, but there could be one.
What's your single sentence pitch for FDP for a skeptical clinician?
Well, for decades, the centre has foisted expensive systems on you that don't fit how you actually work. FDP's a chance to build something that does.
Nice. And then what's your single sentence pitch for FDP to a skeptical MP?
You've left the NHS to struggle with data for 2 decades with no effective strategy. Don't tear down the only strategy that actually works before you've got something to replace it with.
And then last question is, what's one piece of advice you would give to a Palantir executive?
Well, I guess, their roots are in defence and intelligence, but their NHS customers and nurses, paramedics and clinicians. I just encourage them to talk to them in their language, not in your language.
Like, what do you mean by that?
Well, they're talking about. It sounds to me when you listen to those Palantir execs, they are talking very much to people who are in the military, who are in the security services. They're talking about Western hard power and things like that. That's not the world of the NHS, and so the invitation to Palantir is to think about what would resonate with the NHS, given they're a big customer who a big long-term investment for you. What would you say to them that would resonate with them?
Super interesting. Thank you so much, Tom. This was really, really good. I really appreciate it. Yeah, I had a really good time. Thank you.
Me too. Thanks for having me.